In 1989, a young female police officer walked out of her home and vanished. Her car was found abandoned, the keys still in the ignition, her duty gear missing. For weeks, search teams combed through rivers, forests, and back roads, but every trail went cold. It was as if she had slipped off the face of the earth. Then silence. The case faded. People moved on, but her family never stopped waiting. 17 years later, miles away from where she disappeared, a couple bought an old farmhouse. While exploring its dusty attic, they stumbled on a locked wooden trunk. When they forced it open, what they saw inside would shatter the case wide open. A police gun belt, a name tag, and a chilling discovery that proved she hadn't simply walked away. Someone had hidden the truth right above their heads. But here's the question: who put it there, and why did it take nearly 2 decades to find? Stick around, because the answer is darker than anyone imagined, and it all comes down to one attic. If this story gave you chills, hit like and subscribe for more real-life mysteries every week. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Have you ever seen something so strange, so unexplainable that it still haunts you? Share your story below. I'll be reading. In 1989, in a quiet American town, a young woman wore the uniform with pride. She was only in her 20s, but already one of the most respected officers in the department. Her name carried weight. People described her as tough, fearless, and sharp. Yet she was also kind, the type who would comfort a scared child or help an elderly neighbor without hesitation. Her journey into policing was not easy. She had pushed through training where many doubted her. Some older officers didn't believe a woman could handle the streets. She proved them wrong every day. Arrests, patrols, investigations, she did it all, often better than the men who questioned her. Her dedication showed. She worked long hours, often volunteering for difficult shifts. If someone needed backup, she was there. If a case needed late-night follow-up, she stayed. People noticed. Her family spoke about how proud they were, though they also worried. Being a cop meant risk, and in 1989, crime was not rare. But she seemed unshakable. She carried herself with calm strength, like nothing could break her. To the community, she was more than just an officer. She was hope. When she walked into a room, people felt safe. That is why What Happened Next broke everyone. If someone like her, smart, respected, careful, could vanish without a trace, then nobody was safe. Her story would become the town's greatest mystery, a nightmare that haunted her family, her friends, and her fellow officers for years. The morning she disappeared began like any other. She woke up early in her small house, put on her uniform, and brewed a cup of coffee. Her family said she looked calm, maybe even cheerful. There was no sign of fear or stress. She sat at the kitchen table, eating a quick breakfast. The radio played quietly in the background. She chatted with her mother about errands she planned to run later. Everything felt normal, ordinary, safe. Before leaving, she made sure her badge and gun belt were ready. She double-checked the mirror, hair neat, uniform sharp. She carried herself like a professional who took her job seriously. She hugged her mother, grabbed her keys, and stepped out the door. The sound of her car starting up was the last her family ever heard. Neighbors later recalled nothing unusual that morning. She drove away like she always did, steady and focused. No speeding, no rushing, just another routine day. But what no one knew was that she would never come home. By evening, when her car was found abandoned on a quiet street, doors unlocked and keys still in the ignition, panic began to spread. Something was very wrong. Late that evening, a call came in. A car sat strangely on a side street near the edge of town. It was hers. When officers arrived, they expected some simple breakdown, maybe even that she had stepped away for a minute. But as they approached, a chill set in. The car doors were unlocked, the driver's door slightly open. Her keys still dangled in the ignition. Inside, everything looked normal. Her purse rested on the passenger seat. Nothing was dumped out or stolen. There was no sign of a fight, no broken glass, no blood. The seat was pushed back as if she had stepped out for just a moment and planned to return. But she never did. Detectives crouched around the car with flashlights, searching for footprints, fingerprints, anything. The ground gave them nothing. The car wasn't damaged. It was as if she had parked and then simply vanished into thin air. One officer later described it as the eeriest scene he had ever worked. It felt frozen, he said, like time had stopped. For her family, the news hit like a thunderbolt. She wasn't the type to just walk away. Something terrible had happened, and it had happened fast. The moment her fellow officers heard the news, the department erupted into chaos. Radios lit up with urgent chatter. Commanders barked orders. Patrol cars tore out of the lot with sirens blaring. They were not searching for a stranger. They were searching for one of their own. Roadblocks went up at every highway exit. Officers stopped cars, questioned drivers, and checked IDs. Helicopters circled overhead with spotlights, combing fields and riverbanks. Inside the station, phones rang non-stop. Detectives scrambled to pull her recent case files, wondering if an angry criminal had taken revenge. Every name she had arrested suddenly became a suspect. But beneath the fast action was fear, deep, raw fear. If a police officer could vanish without a trace, then no one was untouchable. You could feel it in every corner of the station. Hardened cops looked shaken. Some refused to leave the radio, desperate for updates. Others drove aimlessly through neighborhoods, hopping for any sign. The chief made it clear, nothing else mattered now. Finding her was the department's only priority. But as night stretched into morning and morning stretched into the next day, the panic grew heavier. Leads came in, then collapsed. The car gave no answers. Witnesses had seen nothing. The realization began to sink in. She wasn't just late, she wasn't just lost. She was gone. By the second day, word had spread far beyond the police station. The entire town seemed to vibrate with fear. Neighbors gathered on porches, whispering about what had happened. Mothers pulled their children inside earlier than usual, locking doors before nightfall. The thought was chilling. If a trained officer could disappear without a sound, what chance did ordinary citizens have? Reporters swarmed the streets, their cameras flashing, their microphones thrust into anyone who might speak. Headlines screamed across newspapers, "Officer missing without a trace." News vans lined up near the police station, feeding a steady stream of speculation into living rooms across the state. And then came the rumors. Some swore they saw a strange car idling on back roads. Others whispered about a stalker. A few even muttered that maybe she had run away from her own life, though those who knew her dismissed that thought instantly. The town felt divided, half desperate for answers, half unwilling to believe such a thing could happen in their own backyard. Shops closed earlier. Churches held impromptu vigils. Strangers hugged each other on the street. The community clung together, but under the surface was raw fear. This wasn't just about one missing officer anymore. It was about safety itself. For weeks, the town became the stage of a massive search. Officers, volunteers, and even out-of-town deputies combed the countryside. Lines of people walked shoulder to shoulder through fields, scanning for clothing, tire marks, anything. Rivers were dragged. Abandoned houses were forced open and searched from cellar to attic. Helicopters hovered low over forests, their blades chopping the air, spotlights cutting across the dark. Search dogs were brought in from other counties, their noses pressed to the ground, handlers urging them on. But every time hope flared, it died just as quickly. Dogs caught a scent, then lost it within minutes. Tips flooded in, but none held weight. One day a farmer claimed to hear cries in the woods. When officers rushed there, they found nothing but silence. Detectives dug into her recent arrests, interrogating suspects, knocking on doors. But no case connected, no motive fit. Days turned into weeks and still nothing. No body, no weapon, no sign of struggle. The trail didn't just grow cold, it seemed to vanish into thin air. By the end of the month, the search had become more ritual than rescue. People still gathered, still combed fields, but in their hearts they knew. Whatever had happened, it had swallowed her whole. The town remained haunted, waiting for an answer that refused to come. Detectives knew the first step in any disappearance was to go back to the beginning. Who was she? Where had she been? What was happening in her life before she vanished? They started by pulling her schedule. She was the type of officer who wrote everything down. Every shift, every call, every errand neatly logged in a small planner. At first glance, her routine looked ordinary. Work, gym, family visits. Nothing stood out. Then they moved on to her friends. Most described her the same way. Tough but fair, loyal, someone you could count on. She was social but not reckless. A few admitted she had been stressed recently, though none could say exactly why. Her family painted a slightly different picture. They described her as dedicated but overworked. She often skipped meals and pushed herself harder than most. Her mother remembered her saying she was dealing with something at work but refusing to explain further. Detectives also traced her last phone calls. One to her mother the night before, short and warm. Another to a fellow officer just hours before she vanished. But when detectives questioned that officer, he claimed the call was nothing important, just a reminder about paperwork. Piece by piece, the investigators began to realize her life wasn't as simple as it first seemed. As detectives dug deeper, a troubling pattern began to appear. Interviews with fellow officers revealed cracks in the department. She had clashed with several senior officers in the months before her disappearance. Some accused her of being too aggressive on calls. Others whispered that she did know her place. Behind closed doors, she had filed complaints about harassment. She felt undermined, ignored, and even targeted by those who outranked her. But each time she brought it up, the paperwork seemed to vanish, or the complaint was brushed aside. Whispers of jealousy also surfaced. She was young, respected by the community, and earning praise from outside the department. That didn't sit well with some of her older, more jaded colleagues. Detectives learned of one specific incident weeks before she disappeared. She had a heated argument with a superior officer after accusing him of mishandling a case. Witnesses said voices were raised, threats were exchanged, and afterward she seemed shaken. The deeper detectives looked, the more obvious it became. She may have been wearing a badge, but she wasn't safe even among her own. Her disappearance now had a chilling new angle. Maybe the danger wasn't from a stranger at all. Maybe it had been inside the department the whole time. When detectives sat down with her family again, one detail stood out. Weeks before she vanished, she had confided something unsettling. She told her sister she felt like someone was following her. At first, the family thought it was stress. She worked tough cases, and paranoia wasn't uncommon in law enforcement. But then neighbors started to mention something strange too. A dark sedan had been seen parked near her house at odd hours. It never stayed long, but it kept showing up. One neighbor remembered waking up late one night and spotting the same car idling with its headlights off. When she stepped outside to look closer, the car slowly pulled away, disappearing into the dark. Detectives chased this lead hard. They canvassed the area, tracked vehicle registrations, and set up tips lines. Dozens of calls came in about suspicious cars, but none matched. It was as if the car and the driver had vanished along with her. Her family was sure this was connected. She hadn't imagined it. Someone had been watching her. And maybe, on the night she disappeared, that shadow finally moved in. With no car and no clear suspect inside the department, detectives turned to the streets. She had arrested dozens of dangerous offenders, drug dealers, burglars, violent men who hated cops. Any one of them could have wanted revenge. Detectives started re-interviewing these old cases. One man she had helped put away for armed robbery told investigators, "If I ever saw her again, I'd make her pay." Another, a repeat offender, admitted he had once followed her patrol car just to scare her. It sounded threatening, but when pressed, none of them had solid connections to the night she vanished. Most were either locked up or had alibis checked out by parole officers. Detectives built long lists of names and ran background checks again and again, but each road led nowhere. By the end of that year, the criminal angle was still on the table, but there was no smoking gun. Revenge might have been a motive, but there was no proof. The case stalled again, leaving investigators to wonder, if not a criminal and not a stranger, then who had enough access and power to make a cop disappear without a trace? Detectives were running out of options, so they went old school and extreme. Every officer who had worked with her was dragged back in for questioning. Polygraph exams were ordered. Some passed, others showed inconclusive results, but no one confessed and no solid evidence came out of it. Stakeouts were set up around the neighborhoods where the dark sedan had been spotted. Unmarked cars sat for hours, engines off, waiting. Nights passed. Nothing. Hidden microphones were wired into bars where officers liked to drink. Hopping loose words might reveal secrets. But the tapes came back empty. Just gossip and complaints about long shifts. Detectives even followed her closest colleagues off duty, just to see if any strange behavior emerged. Days turned to weeks, and again, nothing. Each tactic burned resources and trust. Morale inside the department sank. Some officers began to resent being treated like suspects. After months of pressure, detectives had to admit the truth. All their tricks, all their traps had caught nothing. The case wasn't just cold, it was frozen. The silence didn't last long. Once the media learned a female cop had vanished without a trace, the story exploded. Satellite trucks parked outside the police station. National news anchors demanded answers. Headlines screamed, "Officer missing, where's the justice?" Talk shows speculated wildly. Some claimed she had been kidnapped by a serial killer. Others hinted she was living under a new name, running from secrets of her own. The pressure on detectives became unbearable. At press conferences, cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. Is this an inside job? Why can't you protect your own? The department tried to project control, but inside they were cracking. Leads were failing, tips were drying up, and the world was watching them stumble. For her family, the attention was a nightmare. They wanted answers, not TV debates. But the cameras stayed, feeding on every rumor, while the truth stayed hidden. Months passed, and the investigation that once shook the town began to slow. At first, there had been daily briefings, constant searches, and reporters on every corner. But slowly, the energy drained away. The press moved on to the next big story. News vans disappeared from the streets. Headlines that once carried her name in bold letters grew smaller and smaller until they vanished completely. For detectives, the case file grew heavier but not any clearer. Leads that had once seemed promising turned to nothing. Tips dried up. Witnesses who swore they saw something eventually admitted they were mistaken. The wall of evidence was empty. No body, no weapon, no suspect. Her family felt this change deeply. In the early days, they had believed the case was on the edge of breaking. Every time the phone rang, they thought it would be news. But as the months passed, the silence grew louder. Calls stopped coming. Detectives stopped visiting as often. Hope began to feel more like a burden than a lifeline. Her mother would sit by the window for hours, staring at the street, waiting for her daughter to come walking up the driveway. Her father stopped talking much at all, retreating into long silences. Her siblings tried to carry on with school and work, but the shadow of her absence followed them everywhere. Every birthday, every holiday, every family dinner carried an empty chair that no one dared touch. At night, her sister sometimes dreamed that she heard footsteps on the porch. She would run to the door, fling it open, only to see nothing but the quiet dark. Those dreams left her waking in tears, more broken than before. The family kept her room exactly as it had been. The bed neatly made. The uniform she wore on her last shift hung carefully in the closet. It became a shrine to the life she had built and the promise she carried. But walking into that room felt like stepping into a wound that never healed. Community support faded too. In the beginning, neighbors brought meals, organized vigils, and tied ribbons on trees. But time wore down even the strongest sympathies. People stopped stopping by. The vigils grew smaller until they ended. The town wanted to move forward, but the family could not. Her mother described it later as living inside a question mark. Every day began and ended the same way, with not knowing. The hardest part wasn't just that she was gone, it was the lack of answers. Had she suffered? Was she still alive somewhere? Was someone out there laughing at their pain? The family turned these questions over in their minds until they became unbearable. Detectives told them not to give up hope, but the words felt hollow. They had heard them too many times. Each visit, each update ended the same way. We're doing everything we can. But the family began to feel abandoned, just like the case itself. By the end of that year, the investigation was little more than a cold file sitting in storage. For the family, the heartbreak was constant, never fatting, never letting them breathe. They were left clinging to a thin thread of hope, but in their hearts they knew the truth. Their daughter, their sister, their friend, she wasn't coming home, and without answers they were trapped in a nightmare with no end. When years pass without answers, people start to fill the silence with stories. In her case, the rumors came fast. Some whispered that she had staged her own disappearance. Maybe she wanted to escape the pressure of being a cop. Maybe she was tired of the dangers and the politics of the department. Others claimed she was drowning in debt, though no records ever showed proof. A few swore she had a secret boyfriend no one knew about, and that she might have run away with him. One wild theory said she was living under a new name in another state. Sightings popped up. Someone thought they saw her at a gas station in Texas. Another claimed she was waitressing in Florida. But every sighting collapsed when checked. Detectives investigated each rumor. Bank accounts were untouched. No credit cards used. No passport activity. Her uniform, her badge, her car, all left behind. Nothing pointed to her walking away by choice. Still, the whispers wouldn't stop. In a small town, gossip spread like fire. Every time someone new vanished from the headlines, her name came back with a new twist. The theory of a secret life haunted her family. They refused to believe it, but they couldn't silence the talk. As time dragged on, a darker set of theories began to grow. These didn't point to strangers or secret lives. They pointed to the people closest to her. Some locals whispered that she had been betrayed by someone she trusted, maybe even someone she loved. Old boyfriends were dragged into conversations. Every fight, every breakup was picked apart as if it held the answer. One man she dated briefly was suddenly painted as a suspect, though he had no connection to the night she vanished. Others turned their attention to her colleagues. She had clashed with fellow officers and more than once complained about being harassed. People began to ask, what if the person who made her disappear wore the same uniform she did? What if the danger wasn't out there on the streets but right beside her the whole time? There were even whispers that a family member might have known more than they admitted. Relatives denied it strongly, but small-town gossip is relentless. A brother who didn't cry enough at the vigil, an uncle who skipped an interview. Every small detail turned into suspicion. Detectives tried to chase these betrayal theories, but they hit wall after wall. No evidence, no confession, just talk. But the damage was already done. The community began to turn on itself. Trust between neighbors cracked. People looked at one another with doubt. A chilling question spread through town. If one of us could do this to her, who can we trust at all? Her family hated these theories most of all. They knew she was loyal, loving, and careful. They believed with all their hearts she would never run, and she would never fall into some secret betrayal. To them, these rumors felt like a second wound, an attack on her memory. But the problem was simple. Without answers, every theory stayed alive. Betrayal close to home became one of the most powerful, and it would shadow her case for years to come. Years later, retired officers began to whisper about something darker. They said she had been asking questions inside the department, not about small issues, but about misconduct, things that could ruin careers. Files hinted she had started keeping notes on overtime scams, missing evidence, even rumors of officers working with criminals. It wasn't proven, but there were enough fragments to make investigators pause. If she had been digging into corruption, that would have made her dangerous. A young, ambitious cop who wouldn't stay quiet. One retired officer told a reporter, she was onto something, she knew too much. Detectives revisited this angle years later, but the trail was ice cold. Records were missing. Witnesses refused to talk. Every clue that pointed to corruption ended in silence. Still, the theory stuck. Maybe she hadn't vanished because of a secret life or a jealous lover. Maybe she had been silenced to protect powerful men inside her own department. When official investigators hit walls, private detectives stepped in. Families desperate for answers pooled money to hire them. Hoping a fresh set of eyes would break the case. These investigators chased every tip, no matter how strange. One man claimed he saw her at a diner years later, but when checked, the sighting was fake. Another witness said he knew who killed her, then demanded money to reveal more. That lead collapsed into lies. A psychic even contacted the family, insisting she could sense where the officer was. Search teams followed her directions into woods, only to find nothing but trees and silence. Each false trail drained time, money, and hope. Still, the private eyes kept trying. They dug through phone records, interviewed old suspects, and knocked on doors long forgotten. But each time the result was the same: dead ends. The case seemed cursed. Every time a path looked promising, it snapped shut. By the 10-year mark, her name was nearly forgotten outside her small town. But inside her family's home, the questions never stopped. They refused to let her memory die, even as the world moved on. Not everyone moved on. A small group of retired officers refused to let the case die. These men had worked with her. They knew her. And to them, her disappearance wasn't just another file, it was personal. They kept boxes of evidence in their homes: old reports, photos, maps marked with red ink. At night, their basements looked more like case rooms than storage. Each box was a reminder that she was still missing. Every few weeks they gathered, sometimes at a diner off the highway, other times in one of their living rooms. They drank black coffee, spread out papers, and argued over theories. One would point to her last call on the radio. Another would insist she'd been taken by someone she trusted. A third believed it was tied to corruption, a cover-up that went deeper than anyone realized. They didn't always agree, but they all shared one thing: they couldn't let go. They wrote letters to the state, called old contacts, begged to reopen certain leads, but the response was always the same: no new evidence, no new case. So they pressed on alone. One of them said, "If we stop talking about her, then she's gone for good." That became their rule. As long as they kept meeting, as long as her name was spoken, she was still out there, somewhere. It wasn't justice, but it was the closest thing they had. 10 years, that's how long it had been since she vanished. By now, the case was ice cold. The files sat in storage. Dust gathered on the boxes. For the department, it was history. For the public, it was a mystery long forgotten. But for her family, it was a wound that never healed. Her parents aged faster than they should have. Her mother still left the porch light on every night. She said it was for when her daughter finally came home. Her father rarely spoke of her anymore, but sometimes in the middle of dinner he'd just stop and stare, like he was somewhere else. Her siblings carried the weight too. Holidays were hollow. Birthdays were reminders. Every time the phone rang, they thought maybe this is the call, but it never was. The town had changed. New families moved in. Children grew up never knowing her name. To them, she was just a rumor, an old story told by older neighbors. But for those who remembered, the silence was the hardest part. No new clues, no arrests, no answers, just the echo of a life cut short. Some locals whispered that maybe she'd never be found. Others believed the truth was buried somewhere close, maybe even in plain sight. Her family clung to small rituals. They visited her empty grave, a stone carved with her name but no date of death. They left flowers, notes, and photographs. It was the only place they could go. The retired officers still met, but even their meetings grew quieter. The theories felt recycled. Leads dried up. Frustration turned into resignation. Year after year, nothing changed. And yet the pain never dulled. Her mother once told a reporter, "It feels like waiting for a ghost to walk back through the door." That's what every day was, a waiting game, waiting for the knock, waiting for the call, waiting for an answer that never came. 10 years of silence, 10 years of heartbreak, and still the mystery of what happened to her remained as dark as the night she vanished. In 2006, a young couple thought they had found their dream. The farmhouse was old, weathered, and sat on several quiet acres just outside town. It wasn't perfect. The paint peeled, the roof sagged in places, and the floors creaked with every step. But the price was low, and they believed with enough work they could turn it into a home. From the first day, though, something felt off. When they stepped inside, the air was strangely heavy. The sunlight through the windows seemed duller, like it struggled to brighten the rooms. The wife mentioned it to her husband, but he brushed it off as nerves. "It's just an old house," he said. They unpacked, filled the rooms with boxes, and tried to imagine their future here. The kitchen would need remodeling. The bedrooms needed paint. The barn outside leaned badly, but maybe one day they'd fix that too. Neighbors came by, bringing pies and warm smiles. They were kind, but a few of them gave odd glances when the couple mentioned the property. One man paused, then only said, "That house has been empty a long time." At night, the strangeness deepened. The floors popped loudly even when no one was walking. Doors that had been shut were found cracked open. Their dog barked at the walls, ears pinned back, refusing to go upstairs. Still, the couple pushed forward. They painted, cleaned, and patched holes. They told themselves every old house creaks, every dog gets spooked. But underneath their effort, the house carried a weight, and soon they would discover why. A week after moving in, the husband climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. The ceiling sloped low, the wood smelled of age, and dust hung thick in the air. That's when he saw it. At the far end of the hallway, a door was shut tight. Rusted nails ran across the frame, hammered in at sharp angles. Not just one nail, dozens. It didn't look like repair. It looked like someone had tried to make sure the door never opened again. The husband called for his wife. She came up the stairs, flashlight in hand. When she saw it, her face went pale. "Why would someone seal a door shut like that?" she whispered. They stared at it together. The wood was old, cracked, and scarred with hammer marks. Whoever had done this hadn't been careless. They'd taken their time. The wife wanted to leave it alone. "If someone sealed it, maybe there's a reason," she said, but curiosity pulled at the husband. That night he couldn't sleep. Every time the house groaned, his mind went back to that door. What was behind it? Storage, something dangerous, or something worse? The next day he brought a hammer upstairs. With each swing, the nails bent loose, shrieking against the wood. The sound echoed through the house. His wife begged him to stop, her voice shaking, but he kept going. Finally, with one last pull, the door gave way. The wood creaked, the hinges moaned, and the door swung open into darkness. Inside, the air was colder. The space was small, more of a hidden room than an attic. And in the corner, covered in dust, sat something that made them both step back in shock. It wasn't junk, it wasn't storage. It was a single wooden chair, facing the wall. And on the wall above it, deep scratches ran across the plaster, as if someone had clawed at it for years. The couple froze. The room was silent but heavy, like it had been waiting for them. They didn't know it yet, but opening that door had just pulled them straight into the heart of a mystery that had been buried for decades. The couple tried to ignore the sealed attic for days. They went about fixing the house, patching walls, mowing the grass, and painting rooms. But every time they walked upstairs, their eyes landed on that nailed-shut door. Finally, one evening after dinner, they decided they couldn't leave it alone anymore. The husband grabbed a crowbar, and his wife, though nervous, followed him upstairs. He jammed the tool against the wood. With a loud crack, the first board snapped loose. Dust sprayed into the air, stinging their eyes. The smell was thick, like mold, mixed with something older, harder to name. Piece by piece, they pulled at the frame. Nails screeched as they bent free. The wood splintered under each strike. Their dog barked downstairs, whining, packing like it wanted them to stop. After nearly an hour of work, the last nail came loose. The husband shoved the door hard, and it broke free. A cloud of dust rolled out, filling the narrow hallway. The wife coughed and covered her face. The flashlight beam cut through the haze, landing on a space neither of them expected. It wasn't just a crawl space. It was a full, hidden attic room. Cobwebs hung thick like curtains. Wooden beams groaned overhead. Boxes sat stacked against the far wall, their edges chewed by rodents. The air was colder than the rest of the house, enough to make the wife shiver. But what caught their eyes was in the corner. A large wooden trunk. It sat low to the ground, square and heavy. Its lid was lined with iron, and a thick padlock clamped it shut. The wood was scratched, dark stains spreading across its surface. The wife whispered, "I don't like this." The husband didn't answer. He stepped closer, his flashlight bouncing off the iron. He touched the surface. It was cold, rough, and sticky in places. Every instinct told them to leave it alone, but curiosity was stronger. The wife finally said, "Tomorrow, let's look at it tomorrow." They backed out of the attic, pulling the door shut behind them. That night neither of them slept. The image of the trunk sat in their minds, growing heavier with each passing hour. The next morning they went back upstairs. This time the husband brought tools, a hammer, a flathead screwdriver, and bolt cutters borrowed from a neighbor. The trunk looked worse in daylight. Scratches ran deep across the surface, some in long lines, others jagged, as if carved in panic. Dark patches stained the wood, and the padlock was rusted but solid. The wife hovered near the door. She wanted to stop, to walk away, but she couldn't. The husband knelt down and tried the lock first with the screwdriver. Metal clanged, but it wouldn't budge. He struck it with the hammer, still nothing. Finally, he set the bolt cutters on the loop of the lock and leaned with all his weight. With a loud snap, the lock broke free. The couple froze. The sound echoed through the attic. The husband placed his hands on the lid. He hesitated, staring at the stains. "Ready?" he asked. The wife shook her head, but she didn't tell him to stop. Slowly he lifted the lid. The hinges groaned, dust spilling into the air. Inside they expected clothes, maybe old letters or junk. What they saw instead made them both step back, eyes wide, hearts racing. The trunk wasn't filled with junk. It was filled with something that would drag them straight into the darkest part of the missing officer's story. The couple stared into the trunk, afraid to touch what they saw. Inside, wrapped in old rags, lay a police gun belt. The leather was cracked and stiff, the metal buckle dulled with rust. Resting on top of it was a badge, its shine long gone but its number still clear. The wife reached out with trembling fingers, pulling away another rag. Beneath it lay torn pieces of a uniform, dark blue cloth shredded at the seams. The edges looked burned or rotted. Then they saw the name tag. It was small, bent, but still legible, and it carried the name of the officer who had vanished back in 1989. The wife gasped and stumbled backward, covering her mouth. The husband dropped the rag, his hands shaking. This wasn't junk, this wasn't storage. They were staring at evidence. Real, physical proof that connected their farmhouse to the most infamous disappearance the town had ever known. The air in the attic felt even colder now. The couple looked at each other. Their faces were pale, their breaths unsteady. Neither wanted to say it out loud, but both were thinking the same thing. This was not supposed to be here. The wife whispered, "What if the killer lived here?" The husband didn't wait. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911 with shaking hands. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance. Police cruisers pulled into the dirt driveway. The couple met them outside, too scared to go back upstairs. Detectives climbed the old staircase and stepped into the attic. The moment they saw the trunk, everything changed. Gloves went on, evidence bags were unrolled, cameras clicked, the attic was sealed off. The farmhouse, just hours earlier a dream project for the young couple, was now a crime scene. Yellow tape went up across the porch. Neighbors gathered on the road, whispering as unmarked cars filled the yard. Detectives handled each piece with care. The gun belt, the badge, the torn uniform with its name tag, every item was tagged and bagged. For the first time in 17 years, the case had something real, something more than rumors and theories. News spread quickly. Reporters showed up by nightfall. Their lights glared against the farmhouse windows as they broadcast the discovery. The couple sat in silence, shaken, realizing their new home had carried a secret darker than they ever imagined. For investigators, this was no longer a cold case. It was back open. Detectives knew the attic discovery wasn't random. Someone had lived in that farmhouse during the time of the officer's disappearance. The question was, who? They pulled the county records and began tracing the property's history. Old deeds and tax forms were spread across desks. One name from 1989 stood out. The owner back then wasn't just anyone. He had once worn a badge himself. The farmhouse had belonged to a man who used to serve as a police officer in the same region. On paper, he had left the force quietly, with no public scandal, no big headline. But his exit had always felt sudden, almost hidden. Detectives leaned in. The puzzle pieces started shifting. Why would a former cop have a missing officer's badge and gun belt locked away in his attic? Neighbors from that time were interviewed. Some recalled seeing him moving heavy boxes into the attic late at night. Others said he kept to himself, rarely letting anyone inside the house. The picture was getting darker. This wasn't a stranger or random criminal. The trail led back to someone who once wore the same uniform as the woman who vanished. The case was turning inside out. When detectives dug into the ex-cop's past, they found two versions of him. The first was the public image. He was known as dependable, steady, and even friendly at times. On the surface, he looked like the kind of man you'd trust to protect your town. His record, at least the official one, showed years of service and commendations. But the deeper detectives went, the darker things became. Buried in old personnel files were warnings. He had been written up for anger issues. There were notes about violent outbursts, shouting matches with supervisors, and complaints from colleagues who said he held grudges for years. Rumors swirled that he had been jealous of younger officers rising in the ranks. Some said he felt pushed aside, replaced. Others hinted he had a particular problem with female officers, dismissing them, mocking them, and clashing with them in private. Detectives began interviewing retired officers who had worked with him. Many hesitated at first, their eyes darting away, as if speaking about him was dangerous. But slowly, stories spilled out. One said, "He was the kind of guy who smiled to your face but wanted you gone the second you crossed him." Another admitted the missing officer had once complained about him directly. She felt he was watching her too closely, that he disliked how quickly she was earning respect. The ex-cop's reputation outside the department was no better. Old neighbors described him as short-tempered. He fought with people over small disputes, loud arguments that lasted into the night. What unsettled detectives most were the timelines. His quiet departure from the force happened only months after she disappeared. Taken together, the clues painted a chilling picture. This wasn't just a man with a temper. He was someone who carried grudges, resented colleagues, and left his job under suspicious timing. And now, the belongings of the missing officer had surfaced in his old attic. It was more than coincidence. It was a shadow that pointed straight at him. Detectives circled back to the neighborhood, knocking on old doors and speaking with people who had lived near the farmhouse in 1989. At first, most shrugged. 17 years had passed, memories had faded, but then small details began to surface. One neighbor remembered hearing noises late at night, the sound of heavy dragging across wooden floors. Another recalled seeing the ex-cop out in the yard past midnight, his shirt soaked in sweat, moving back and forth with boxes in his arms. A woman down the road described how the attic light flicked on at strange hours, glowing long after everyone else in the neighborhood had gone to sleep. At the time, no one thought much of it. He was private, a little strange, but not the kind of man you would accuse without reason. Now those old memories felt different. Every box he carried, every light left on, every strange noise drifting across the quiet fields. It all pointed to one chilling idea. He wasn't just storing junk in that attic. He was hiding a secret, and he had hidden it where no one dared to look. The trunk was no longer just a curious object. It was now the centerpiece of a forensic investigation. Experts in gloves and white suits carried it carefully out of the farmhouse attic and into a controlled lab space. Bright lights hit its wooden frame, showing years of scratches and stains. At first glance, it looked like simple wear and tear, but the team didn't stop at glances. They dusted every inch for prints. None usable. They scraped the wood, tested fibers, and ran swabs along its surface. Hidden beneath layers of dust, they found something faint, dark streaks that didn't look like age. Under chemical lights, the truth appeared. Faint blood stains were hidden in the cracks of the wood. The room grew quiet. Samples were taken immediately, each sealed into sterile containers. The lead investigator signed off on the paperwork and rushed the evidence to the state lab. For 17 years, the case had been nothing but rumor. Now, for the first time, they had a chance at hard science. If the blood matched the missing officer, it would be undeniable. The trunk wasn't just storage. It was a container of a crime. Days later, the results came back. The DNA belonged to her. The news spread fast inside the department. After years of dead ends, detectives finally had their proof. It wasn't speculation anymore. It wasn't gossip or theory. The missing officer had been in that farmhouse. Her blood was locked inside that trunk. The cold case had just turned into a murder investigation. The lab results came in quietly, but the impact was explosive. The blood found inside the trunk was tested, double-checked, and confirmed. It belonged to the missing officer. For 17 years, her family had lived in limbo. They hoped she might still be alive somewhere, trapped or hidden but breathing. Now, science closed that door forever. She hadn't run away. She hadn't started a new life. She hadn't disappeared by choice. She was murdered. Detectives delivered the news to her family. Faces crumpled. Some cried. Others sat in silence, unable to process the words. 17 years of waiting had ended in the worst way possible. For the investigators, the DNA was the turning point. All the rumors about affairs, debts, or a secret life were now irrelevant. The case was no longer about a disappearance. It was a homicide, and the evidence pointed directly at a man who had once worn the same uniform she did. The story had shifted forever. What was once a mystery was now a murder case. With the DNA results in hand, detectives started from scratch. Every old file was reopened. Every lead was re-examined. But this time the focus was sharp. They weren't chasing rumors anymore. The theory that she had staged her own disappearance was dead. The whispers about her having a secret life were gone. The evidence was clear. She had been killed, and her killer had gone to great lengths to hide it. Detectives zeroed in on the ex-cop who once owned the farmhouse. He was no longer a name in the margins. He was now the center of the case. For years, the question had been, how does a police officer vanish without a trace? Now the answer was forming. She hadn't vanished at all. She had been silenced by one of their own. The case was alive again, and this time it wasn't going cold. Detectives finally had a name, the ex-cop who once owned the farmhouse. He wasn't living far away. After leaving the force, he moved 2 towns over, bought a small house, and blended in. Neighbors saw him as quiet, maybe even boring. He mowed his lawn, waved to kids on bikes, and kept to himself. No one suspected a thing. But when detectives looked deeper, his calm new life started to crack. His past followed him everywhere. On the force, he was known for being tough, sometimes too tough. Old reports showed he had gotten into fights with suspects, arguments with supervisors, and even bar fights off duty. His temper wasn't just a rumor, it was documented. He carried grudges too. If someone crossed him, he didn't forget. And one of the people who had crossed him most was the missing officer. Detectives began watching him quietly. They drove past his house, checked his routine, and even dug into his trash. He lived simply now, no family, no close friends, just a man trying to fade into the background. But to investigators, that only made him look more suspicious. Why did he leave the force so suddenly? Why had he kept the farmhouse, then sold it right after she vanished? And why did every lead circle back to him? The deeper they dug, the more it seemed like his new life was built on a terrible secret. Detectives knew one thing. They weren't looking at a stranger. They were tracking a man who once wore the same badge as the woman he was accused of killing. The suspect wasn't just part of the story. He was the story. Digging into his record revealed a trail of warnings no one had acted on. He had been suspended twice for excessive force, once for slamming a suspect against a wall, another time for punching a drunk man in handcuffs. Each time he was written up, but each time he came back. There were also fights inside the department. He argued with other officers, cursed at supervisors, and once threw a chair in the break room. His anger wasn't hidden. Everyone saw it. And then there were the complaints. The missing officer, the one who vanished, had filed at least 2 reports against him. She accused him of harassment. She told supervisors he was dangerous. She warned them he might hurt someone one day. But nothing happened. The complaints sat in a file. He stayed on the job. She stayed on the same shift as him, and the tension grew. Other officers later admitted they weren't surprised. They remembered him glaring at her, making crude comments, and once threatening her during an argument. At the time, they thought it was just words. Now, looking back, it seemed like a warning no one took seriously. The pattern was clear. This wasn't a man who lost his temper once. This was a man who lived in anger, and the missing officer had been one of his main targets. Detectives realized something chilling. 17 years earlier, she had predicted exactly what would happen. She said he was dangerous. She said he might go too far. And she was right. Detectives tried to piece together the night she disappeared. They believed it started with a phone call. He knew her routine, knew when she was on duty and when she was. Records suggested he contacted her late in the evening, saying he needed help. Maybe it was a minor police matter. Maybe it was something personal. Whatever it was enough to get her attention. She trusted him. They wore the same badge. Even if they argued, she never thought he would harm her. So when he asked for help, she agreed. That's likely when she got into his car. From there, investigators believed he drove her out to the farmhouse. It was his property. It was private. No one would see them there. Neighbors remembered the sound of a car that night pulling in late. They remembered lights on for a short while. Then silence. Theories say she may have realized too late that it was a trap. He had lured her there under false pretenses. Once inside, she had no chance. The attic, the trunk, the evidence, it all lined up. This wasn't random. This was planned. He didn't just want to hurt her. He wanted to control the narrative of her disappearance. For 17 years, the plan had worked. Until now. The wooden trunk was more than storage. It was a trophy box. Inside were her belongings, the gun belt, badge, and torn pieces of her uniform. To outsiders, they looked like scraps. But to him, they were reminders. Souvenirs he kept close. Psychologists who study killers call this behavior a pattern of control. Some offenders take items to relive the crime, to feel the power again. That's what detectives believed this was. The scratches on the trunk told their own story. It had been opened and closed many times, not by accident, but because he wanted to see what was inside. He wanted to relive it. Detectives pictured him alone in that farmhouse, pulling out the badge, touching the fabric, reminding himself of what he had done. It explained why the trunk was hidden in the attic. It wasn't trash. It wasn't forgotten. It was sacred to him, a dark secret he couldn't let go of. The fact that it stayed sealed for 17 years was chilling. Every time the family hoped for answers, that trunk was sitting just above their heads, holding the truth. Now, with forensics and DNA, it had turned into the key piece of evidence. What he once saw as a prize had become the proof of his guilt. The trunk wasn't just evidence, it was a confession. Detectives confronted him with the evidence. They showed him the DNA results. They showed him the bloodstains, the trunk, the badge, the gun belt. They reminded him of the neighbors who remembered those strange nights. Piece by piece, they stacked the case against him. At first, he denied everything. He claimed he had nothing to do with her. He said the evidence was a mistake or planted, but the weight of the truth was too strong. Every path pointed back to him. After hours of questioning, he finally broke. His voice was low, but his words were clear. He admitted he killed her. He told detectives he had lured her to the farmhouse. He said they argued, tempers flared, and he snapped. But his actions after the killing showed planning, not rage. He confessed to hiding her body beneath the farmhouse floorboards, sealing it away where no one would find it. Then, to keep the secret even tighter, he nailed the attic shut and left the trunk as his private reminder. The room went silent when he said the words. For 17 years, her family had begged for the truth, and now, here it was in the killer's own voice. The confession spread quickly. News outlets broke the story within hours. Headlines screamed the unbelievable. The missing officer had been murdered, and the killer was a fellow cop. Reporters flooded the small town. Cameras lined the courthouse steps. Everywhere, people asked the same question. How could this have been hidden for so long? For her family, the moment was crushing. The confirmation of her death reopened wounds they had carried for nearly 2 decades. But at the same time, it gave them the closure they had begged for. Now they knew. Now they could bury her with dignity. For her colleagues, the confession cut even deeper. One of their own had betrayed the badge. It wasn't an outsider, not some faceless criminal. It was a man they had once worked beside, someone who had sworn the same oath they did. Across the state, the case became a symbol. It showed how secrets could fester inside trusted institutions. It showed how silence, fear, and missed warnings allowed a predator to hide in plain sight. What had been a cold case for 17 years was now a scandal that shook the entire state. The truth was finally out, but it came at a terrible cost. For 17 years, her family lived in the dark. They woke up every day wondering if she was still alive. They went to sleep every night with questions that never ended. Now, detectives sat them down and told them everything. They explained how she was lured away that night. They explained the fight, the farmhouse, and how her body was hidden under the floorboards. They explained the trunk in the attic, filled with her uniform and badge. And finally, they explained how the DNA sealed the case. The room was silent. Some family members cried. Others just stared, too shocked to react. For years, they had begged for answers. Now the truth was in front of them. It was relief, because they finally knew. But it was heartbreak, too, because the truth was worse than anything they had imagined. Her mother asked why no one had stopped him. Her brother wanted to know how a fellow cop could do this and hide it for so long. There were no good answers. After 17 years, they had the truth, but the truth carried a pain that would never go away. The news hit the town hard. For almost 2 decades, people had whispered about what happened to her. Some thought she ran away. Others thought she was killed by strangers. Now, everyone knew the real story, and it was worse than they expected. The town decided to honor her the only way they could. A public memorial was planned. On the day of the service, hundreds of people gathered. Police officers stood in uniform. Families came with flowers. Reporters stood back as the town came together. Even strangers from other cities drove in, wanting to pay respects. At the center of it all was her family. They sat quietly, surrounded by neighbors who promised to never forget her sacrifice. The police chief gave a speech admitting mistakes had been made. A pastor spoke about justice and forgiveness. And one by one, people stepped forward to share memories of her smile, her kindness, her bravery. The service ended with silence. The flag was lowered. A bell rang once for her name. After 17 years of waiting, the town finally gave her the honor she deserved. As the truth spread, the police department came under fire. Reporters asked the same hard questions again and again. Why were her complaints ignored? Why did warnings about the ex-cop vanish in paperwork? Why did no one protect her when she asked for help? Old records showed she had filed reports about harassment. She had told supervisors she was being followed. But instead of action, she was brushed off. Some senior officers had even mocked her behind closed doors. Now the department was forced to answer for those failures. Press conferences turned tense. The police chief struggled to defend choices made years earlier. He said standards were different back then, but the public didn't accept that. Families of other officers stepped forward, sharing stories of being silenced when they complained. The case had opened a wound far deeper than anyone expected. For the first time in years, trust between the town and its police force felt broken. Citizens wanted answers, not excuses. And the department realized it could not hide anymore. Her death wasn't just a tragedy. It was proof of a system that failed her from the inside. The outrage didn't fade, it grew. Lawmakers stepped in, promising change. Bills were introduced to give officers stronger protections when they reported misconduct. No one wanted another story like hers to happen again. New policies demanded complaints be taken seriously, investigated fully, and reviewed outside the chain of command. Whistleblower programs were created. Supervisors who ignored warnings could now face punishment. Her name became tied to these reforms. At every hearing, lawmakers spoke of her case. At every vote, people thought of the officer who was silenced and betrayed. For her family, it was bittersweet. No law could bring her back. No policy could erase 17 years of pain. But knowing her story would protect others gave them a small measure of peace. The changes spread beyond her town. Departments across the state and later the country copied the reforms. Her case had started as a mystery. Now it became a turning point. She had once dreamed of making a difference as an officer. In the end, she did, just not in the way anyone imagined. The farmhouse where everything was hidden had become a symbol of horror. At first, the police sealed it off with yellow tape. For weeks, investigators went through every inch, searching for missed evidence. They pulled up floorboards, checked walls, and dug through the soil beneath the foundation. What they found only deepened the pain: scraps of clothing, traces of blood and marks that hinted at the struggle she endured. Neighbors no longer wanted to look at the house. Some said it felt cursed. Children refused to walk past it on their way to school. For the family of the missing officer, the farmhouse wasn't just a building. It was the place where her life had been taken and hidden for almost 2 decades. City leaders debated what to do. Some wanted to keep the house standing as a reminder. Others argued it should be destroyed to erase the pain. In the end, the decision was made. It would come down. On the day of demolition, crowds gathered. Reporters set up cameras. Her family stood in silence, watching the machine roll forward. With the first swing of the wrecking ball, the old wood cracked apart. Dust filled the air. Each strike felt like the closing of a dark chapter. Piece by piece, the farmhouse collapsed. The attic, where the locked trunk had been hidden, fell in a cloud of debris. The floorboards that once trapped her secret gave way. In less than an hour, the house was gone. What remained was an empty lot, just dirt and broken bricks. But for many, that emptiness felt better than the shadows the farmhouse had held for years. For the town, tearing it down was a statement. They weren't going to let the place stand as a monument to the killer. Instead, it became a symbol of justice finally catching up, even if it had come too late. The lot stayed empty. Grass began to grow where walls once stood. People who drove by pointed and whispered. Some felt sadness. Others felt relief. But no one forgot what had been uncovered there. The farmhouse was gone. The truth was not. The story could have ended in silence. For 17 years, the case had gone cold. No leads, no breakthroughs, no answers. It seemed like the officer's disappearance would remain a mystery forever. And then, by pure chance, a young couple moved into an old farmhouse. They didn't know its history. They didn't know the dark secret hidden above their heads. All they wanted was a home to start fresh. But curiosity changed everything. That attic door, sealed shut with rusty nails, could have been ignored. Most people would have left it alone, assuming it was just old wood or storage no one cared about. But something about it didn't sit right with them. They wanted to know what was behind it. So they pried it open. That decision cracked open more than just a door. It broke open the silence of almost 2 decades. It pulled a hidden story into the light, and it forced justice to finally catch up with a killer who thought he had buried the truth forever. Think about how fragile that moment was. If the couple had decided to paint the walls instead of exploring the attic, the secret would have stayed hidden. If they had covered the nailed door with a shelf or ignored it altogether, the trunk would still be sitting there, untouched, covered in dust. The officer's name might have faded completely, remembered only by her family and a handful of retired cops. Instead, the attic spoke. Inside that trunk were the answers the family had prayed for. The gun belt, the badge, the scraps of her uniform, pieces that told the world she didn't run away. She didn't vanish by choice. She was taken, and her story had been buried in silence. The discovery forced investigators to reopen everything. It led them to the man who had hidden in plain sight for years. It revealed the betrayal that no one wanted to believe, and it gave her family something they had been denied for far too long: the truth. The haunting part is how close it came to never happening. Without the attic, there would be no trunk. Without the trunk, there would be no DNA. Without the DNA, there would be no confession. The chain of events depended on one curious choice made by 2 people who had no idea what they were about to uncover. It's chilling to imagine. For nearly 2 decades, the farmhouse had stood quietly, holding its secret. People drove by. Children played in nearby fields. Life went on, while in the attic the truth waited in silence. When the couple opened that door, they didn't just uncover evidence. They broke the illusion that some crimes stay hidden forever. They proved that even the darkest secrets can't always remain buried. And that's what makes this story unforgettable. A decorated officer vanished. Her case went cold. Rumors, theories, and suspicions filled the years. But in the end, it wasn't police work or science or strategy that cracked it open. It was 2 ordinary people who simply refused to let a locked door stay locked. If not for that attic, the family might still be waiting. The community might still be whispering rumors, and the killer might still be living quietly, carrying his secret to the grave. Instead, the truth came out. The silence ended, and the world finally learned what had happened to her on that night in 1989. The case teaches one final, haunting lesson. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive because of grand plans or perfect investigations. Sometimes it comes because someone, somewhere, asks the simple question, "What's behind that door?"